Night fell over the small town of Cedarville, shrouding it in a blanket of darkness and secrets. Detective James Parker parked his patrol car in front of a modest house on a quiet street. There was an uneasiness in the air, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. After all, it wasn't every day that a respectable man like Richard Turner disappeared. Parker got out of the car and adjusted his hat, breaking the silence of the night with the sound of his footsteps on the asphalt. With a file in hand, he mentally reviewed the details of the case. Richard Turner, a respected college professor at Cedarville University, had last been seen 3 days ago. He had left home to give a talk and had not returned. His wife, Margaret, was desperate for answers. The door to the house opened, revealing a pale and worried woman, her eyes swollen from crying. She identified herself as Margaret Turner, and the detective greeted her warmly before entering the house. "Detective Parker, please come in. I need your help." Richard wouldn't do that. He wouldn't disappear without saying anything. Margaret led Parker into the living room, where photos of the Turner family adorned the shelves and walls. A sense of normalcy contrasted with the growing fear that hovered in the house. The detective sat down on the couch and began asking Margaret a series of questions about Richard's disappearance. She reported that Richard had left for the lecture and never returned. There was no goodbye message, no indication that anything was wrong. He simply disappeared, leaving his family in agony. As they talked, Parker looked at the happy family photos that adorned the living room. The Turners' life seemed perfect, the kind of life many would want. However, something had disturbed this harmony, and it was his job to find out what. Margaret Turner described her husband as a quiet and reserved man, a dedicated academic. He had no apparent enemies, no problems that she knew of. Richard was respected by his colleagues and students, the kind of man who wouldn't draw negative attention. The detective made some notes in his notebook and, before leaving, promised Margaret that he would do everything in his power to find her missing husband. He wanted to reassure her, but he also knew that reality could be much darker than either of them could imagine. After the conversation with Margaret, Parker decided to begin the investigation by interviewing Richard's colleagues and friends at the university. He wanted to understand Richard's life, his routine, and his professional relationships. All initial reports described him as an ordinary man, with no enemies or apparent problems. However, there was one name that kept coming up in conversations: Gregory Roth, another professor at Cedarville University. Parker decided to visit Roth. He found the man in his office, which was filled with piles of dusty books and scattered papers. Roth was a thin, shaggy-haired guy who seemed nervous when asked about Richard Turner. "Detective Parker, I have no idea what happened to Richard," Roth said, avoiding the detective's gaze. Parker continued to pressure Roth, believing he might be hiding important information. As the conversation unfolded, Roth began to contradict himself. He mentioned that Richard had been acting strangely in recent months and that the two had had academic disagreements. Roth also let slip that Richard was working on a highly classified research project. This raised the detective's suspicion. The conversation with Roth made him question whether there was more to Richard Turner's disappearance than first appeared. Richard's behavior and secret project were now key pieces of the puzzle, and Parker was determined to fit them together to uncover the truth behind the mysterious disappearance. The conversation with Gregory Roth had shed new light on Richard Turner's disappearance. Detective Parker felt there was something more behind this enigma and was determined to solve it. He returned to the Turners' home and asked Margaret to provide more information about the confidential research project Richard was working on. She agreed to show Richard's office, where he kept all his notes and documents related to the project. The office was a place of knowledge and wisdom, with shelves filled with books on science and art. However, there was an aura of strangeness in the room, as if something was hiding in the shadows. Margaret indicated a locked folder in a drawer, which contained all the information related to Richard's project. Detective Parker took the folder and carefully opened it. Inside, he found a series of notes, equations, graphs, and complex diagrams. It looked like a study in human behavior, but the exact nature of the project remained a mystery. He spent hours reviewing the notes, but the technical language and academic references made it difficult to fully understand Richard's work. Parker knew he needed expert help to understand the content of the notes. He made copies of the most relevant pages and decided to take them to experts in psychology and human behavior at the university. Perhaps they could shed light on what Richard Turner was investigating. While awaiting the results of the analysis of the notes, the detective continued his investigation. He discovered that in the months leading up to his disappearance, Richard had become increasingly isolated and paranoid. He began to follow a strange nighttime ritual, sneaking out of the house and returning in the early hours of the morning. Parker decided to investigate Richard's nocturnal activities further. He interviewed neighbors and discovered that Richard often visited the woods surrounding the town at night. Some residents reported seeing him talking to himself in the dark, as if he were arguing with someone invisible. The investigation revealed that Richard also visited the local cemetery regularly at night. He left fresh flowers on the grave of a man named Daniel, whose birth and death dates coincided with Richard's own. The townspeople commented on the strangeness of this behavior, and suspicion grew. Parker felt like he was getting closer to solving the mystery, but time was running out. Richard's behavior and secret project led him to believe that his disappearance was related to something dark and sinister. While waiting for the notes to be analyzed, he realized that he needed to look for more clues in the cemetery. The detective made a nocturnal visit to the cemetery, a place that took on an even more chilling atmosphere under the moonlight. He approached Daniel's grave, where Richard used to leave flowers. The tombstone was worn with time, but it was still possible to read the name and dates. Parker examined the ground around the grave, looking for any clues that might be hidden there. That's when he noticed a small object buried in the ground, partially covered by fallen leaves. He knelt down and dug with his hands, revealing a dusty diary. The diary was filled with personal notes and strange drawings, many of which depicted the cemetery in enigmatic symbols. It was evident that the diary belonged to Richard Turner. As Parker flipped through the pages, a sense of uneasiness washed over him. Richard had written about his nocturnal experiences in the cemetery, claiming to have conversations with Daniel, the man buried in the grave. Parker knew this discovery was crucial to the investigation. Richard's bizarre behavior, confidential research project, and mysterious diary were somehow intertwined, forming a complex and terrifying puzzle. Now the detective was determined to put all the pieces together and uncover the truth behind Richard Turner's disappearance. The dusty diary that Detective Parker had found in the cemetery had become a focal point in his investigation. He spent several nights poring over Richard Turner's notes, trying to understand what had led the respectable professor to engage in such strange behavior. The diary pages contained disturbing writings, drawings of mysterious symbols, and accounts of conversations with the man buried in Daniel's tomb. Richard described how, during his nightly visits, he believed Daniel was trying to communicate with him. Conversations ranged from confused delusions to disturbing details that suggested a supernatural connection. Parker was intrigued and disturbed by the notes. He shared his discovery with Margaret Turner, who was equally perplexed. She had no knowledge of her husband's diary or nocturnal activities. The investigation continued, and the detective began talking to psychologists and psychiatrists in an attempt to understand what could have triggered Richard's behavior. Most experts believed he was suffering from a serious psychological disorder, possibly schizophrenia. While the psychological disorder theory was plausible, Parker could not ignore Richard's confidential research project, which contained studies on mind control, drug experiments, and human behavior. The detective was beginning to believe that Richard's mind might have been affected by his research, leading him into a state of confusion and paranoia. To gain more information about the research project, Parker decided to interview Richard's colleagues and students at the university. He soon discovered that many of them were aware of the project, but few knew the exact details. It appeared that Richard had kept the work secret, sharing only the bare minimum with his collaborators. During one of his interviews, the detective spoke to a student named Emily, who had worked as Richard's research assistant. She mentioned that Richard was particularly interested in an experiment that involved using an unknown substance to alter human behavior. She remembered watching him make detailed notes and minute observations during the experiments. Emily also revealed that Richard had become more reclusive as the project progressed, avoiding social interactions and focusing exclusively on his research. This coincided with behavior observed by Margaret and documented in the diary. With this new information, the detective decided to look for samples of the research materials used by Richard in the university laboratory. He hoped that chemical analyses could shed light on the substances used in the experiments. However, when Parker arrived at the lab, he discovered that many of the materials had been destroyed or discarded. The university was concerned about the ethics of Richard's research and had taken steps to terminate the project. This only increased suspicion that Richard's work had crossed ethical and scientific boundaries. Meanwhile, Parker continued his investigation at the cemetery, where Richard's nocturnal activities were carried out. He spoke to caretakers at the cemetery, who confirmed that they had seen Richard talking to Daniel's grave at night. Although most thought he was just dealing with grief, everyone agreed that the behavior was unusual. The detective also visited Daniel's grave, hoping to find additional clues. That's when he noticed a small object buried in the ground, partially covered by dirt and leaves. He knelt down and excavated the object, revealing a silver medallion. The medallion was ancient and engraved with enigmatic symbols. Parker felt a chill run down his spine as the silver locket that Detective Parker had discovered in the cemetery added an additional layer of mystery to this enigmatic case. He kept the medallion carefully and decided to look for clues about its meaning and origin. The feeling that the locket was an important piece of the puzzle never left him. Parker returned to the Turner's house with the locket in hand and showed it to Margaret. She turned pale when she saw it and immediately recognized the object. The locket had belonged to her husband, Richard. He wore it as a good luck charm. The detective began questioning Margaret about the meaning of the locket and how Richard wore it. She revealed that the locket had been in her family for generations and that Richard believed it had special powers. He often referred to the medallion as the key to understanding and claimed it was essential to his research project. Parker realized that the locket could be the missing piece to fully understanding what had happened to Richard. He decided to seek help from experts in ancient symbols and amulets, hoping to unlock the locket's secrets. While awaiting the results of the medallion analysis, the detective continued to investigate Richard's nocturnal behavior at the cemetery. He interviewed local residents and researched the site's history, hoping to find clues about a possible connection between Richard and the man buried in Daniel's grave. Research revealed that Daniel, the man in the grave, had been a resident of Cedarville many decades ago. He was known for his obsession with mysterious symbols and strange rituals, and many considered him an eccentric figure. Daniel's story became even more intriguing when it was discovered that he had disappeared under mysterious circumstances around the same time that Richard had begun his nocturnal visits to the cemetery. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, Parker finally received the results of the locket analysis. Experts identified the symbols as belonging to an ancient secret order that had disappeared centuries ago. This order believed in the power of the mind and supernatural abilities, and their medallion was considered a key to accessing these powers. The connection between the locket, Richard's behavior, and Daniel's grave was now becoming clear. Parker began to believe that Richard had been obsessed with this secret order and was trying to recreate their rituals and experiments to access the powers he believed the locket would give him. As the investigation progressed, Parker got closer and closer to the truth. He was convinced that Richard's disappearance was directly linked to his efforts to access the locket's powers. However, what he still didn't know was the end result of this obsessive search. Parker decided to visit Daniel's grave again, hoping to find some additional clue that would lead him to Richard's location. While observing the grave, he noticed an obscure Latin inscription engraved on the tombstone. With the help of a translator, he discovered that the inscription read, "He who seeks the key to understanding must face the unknown." This cryptic message only increased the mystery surrounding the case. Parker wondered what Richard had faced in his quest for the locket's power and whether he had gone too far. Determined to find out what happened to Richard, the detective continued to investigate. He looked for clues in Richard's academic records, the places he visited at night, and his diary entries. As information accumulated, he began to piece together the bizarre events that led to Richard's disappearance. Detective Parker was determined to find Richard Turner. However, as he delved deeper into the mystery, he began to realize that the unknown he faced could be more terrifying than he had ever imagined.